No matter how strong the enemy, his wish to protect his friends will always make him stronger. Even if his body crumbles and his bones turn to dust, he'd push on with every fabric of his soul, burning fate itself to ashes if it dared stand in his way. Not even to win, but to live, only fighting to keep on laughing with a fire in his belly. And if you're here to watch this video, it sounds like you don't know just how terrifying Fairy Tail's #1 dragon slayer, the ethereous Natsu Dragneel, can be when he gets fired up. As an expert in property damage and beating the grins right off the bad guys' faces, from his final battle with Acnologia to his story in the 100-Year Quest, I'm gonna give you a full breakdown on Natsu and all of his half-dozen one-time use only forms too. Hardly anyone dares to power scale a series with a protagonist who fluctuates so wildly, but because Natsu's been doing this cartoonishly overpowered plot point long before even Mr. Goofy Luffy himself stumbled his way into it, I think it's about high time we ask just how high this Dragon Slayer flies. So be sure to subscribe if you end up liking our content, and from the power to the lore, this is why Natsu Dragneel was built to burn. Now, before we start with the numbers, to get anywhere close to an accurate power scale on this particular character, we're going to have to talk about the lore regarding a certain giant dragon-shaped elephant in the room called consistency. Because whether you've seen Fairy Tail or not, you've probably heard of Natsu's iconic broken nature when it comes to his power of friendship amps just sort of soloing fiction. And we aren't necessarily even just talking about new forms here either, which is an important distinction specifically for Natsu, as he has many transformations from Dragon Force to Fire Dragon King mode, Lightning Flame Dragon mode, and even E&D. But what I'm referring to here is how Natsu can go from being fodder Natsu the Salamander, losing to literal trash, to suddenly Natsu, the king of all things with wings, who can one-punch Fairy Heart Zareth. It would be one thing if Natsu experienced these jumps from arc to arc, like most anime protagonists do, but when his power fluctuates so wildly, even in the span of a singular fight, it's important to ask, what exactly is going on? Well, for anyone who hasn't read to the end of Fairy Tail's first part, I'll quickly give a recap of what I see as an in-universe explanation for his inconsistent and exponential growth. During his early life, some odd 400 years ago, Natsu was killed in a horrendous dragon attack that inspired the likes of his older brother, Zareth, to revive and imbue him with the powers of a curse. Without beating around the bush or explaining haphazardly, Natsu was, from that day, literally built to burn. Just a normal kid without strength or magic, given a second chance at life with the new, solitary goal of ending the immortal Black Wizard's reign. This power of E&D, is the source of all of Natsu's strange, otherworldly abilities. Whether it's his incredible attunement to fire magic, his weird devil form, or yes, even his weird power fluctuations, they're all explained away by him being reborn as Zareth's strongest curse. So what is E&D exactly? Well, as I mentioned in the start of this video, E&D stands for Ethereous Natsu Dragneel. Ethereous referring to the name of the dark magic particulate, a building block that comprises every magic in the world of Fairy Tail, which was specifically used in this curse to revive him. This basically implies that when going all out, Natsu has a near boundless supply of ether nano at his fingertips, just like all those other demons from the Book of Zareth. But under the strict stipulation that unlike all those demons, Natsu is just a human and would have to learn how to use these powers. But be it in episode 1 or 100, Natsu has shown the ability to consistently draw upon fractions of his demonic power under one very arduous stipulation. He has to be fighting for someone other than himself. While a weird rule, this idea of Natsu having two power levels, one associated with base and the other with his friendship amp self, is really consistent. For example, in base he's consistently shown as early as Galuna Island to be Gray's equal, but Urza's direct inferior, with this never seeming to change in their base forms until the end of the story, despite every one of Natsu's ridiculous power jumps. However, when Natsu gets these odd friendship boosts, or starts being serious, even in the character's in-lore suggest he might be even stronger than Urza off-rip, such as Makarov saying that Urza or Natsu could defeat Loxus when he rebelled. Natsu defeating and competing with Jalal when Clearheart Urza couldn't, or even skipping to the end where Gray says everyone would get in the way if they tried to help Natsu take on Zareth. As for why I think it's associated with his pure Ether Nano curse and D&D, the only time in the manga where Natsu completely became fully E&D was when he believed Lucy had died, and went into Berserk mode to complete his goal of absolutely deleting Zareth. Compassion is literally the only thing shown to trigger Natsu's demon powers. Combine this with magic in the world of Fairy Tail literally being the power of spirit, and ambition, It would only really make sense that when he gets fired up, it's simply the power of his true flames leaking out. The reason I personally find it so compelling, though, is also because Ignial claims that Natsu could defeat and overcome END, but knowing what we do now, that doesn't really suggest that he would beat himself in a fistfight, but rather overcome his evil, murder-hungry nature and conquer that power for himself and his friends. So for anyone who didn't know about what makes Natsu tick, his lore basically suggests that his origin, being given the same power as demons like Deliora, gives him malice that even surpasses Acnologia and grants him potential to rival anybody in the series. I would also say it's the most common excuse for how he can go from weaker than base Zeref to one-shotting Fairy Heart Zeref in the span of one very fairly anticlimactic battle. Unlike most things with Natsu though, as I've sort of shown, this allure of 2 power levels stuck with him well through all the 100-year quests so far. But even knowing that his powers have something to do with his wild, ethereal origin, what kind of abilities exactly does this mean Natsu would have? And to put it most plainly, he's one of the most advanced fire users in anime. He can do all the basic things, such as breathing fire, projecting it, and using it to code his attacks, but he takes it a step further with basically autonomous flames, letting him do things like make fire ropes, barriers, and flame wings. Of course, you can mix all that in with his control of other elements, such as lightning, and the way more interesting lost magic part of his fire abilities, dragon slaying. As you might have guessed, I really want to go over a lot of the misconceptions regarding Natsu's Dragon Slayer abilities in particular, since, as we see, Natsu can do some absurd things like burning time or inheriting someone else's magic with this power. So to explain it most basically, Natsu is able to consume a specific element, his being fire, to convert the present ether nanoparticulates in the flames into raw magical combat abilities. Think of this particle sort of like magic molecules. You can't see or interact with them too much, but they're present in different densities within everything. This is also seemingly how Natsu can burn through concepts like time magic by simply burning through the magic comprising the spell, not necessarily negating time. But this also allows Natsu, of course, to have basic fire immunity just by eating flames used against him. And also works far more interestingly by letting him consume other ether nano, or in this case we'll just call it magic, dense fire, for even more insane effects. So, eating magical flames like those of, say, Escanor, Amaterasu, or Yamamoto wouldn't just give Natsu ordinary stat buffs, but because of the way his power works, it would grant him a very large power buff proportional to the level of energy contained in those flames. Which also then poses the most interesting quality of Dragon Slayer magic, inheritance. This is a weird trait that I don't really see anyone talk about a whole lot, but Dragon Slayers struggle with this very difficult concept of overusing their powers, as continued use of Dragon Slayer magic turns its user into a dragon, inheriting the qualities from the dragon they learned the ability from in the case of Natsu. What really makes this interesting though is the fact that it seems like this inheritance feature of taking on the traits Slayers have used or overused fortunately goes both ways. So while yes, they could overuse their powers and get stuck as a dragon, they could also, say, eat a whole other element, like Natsu did with Loxus's lightning, and from then on gain the ability to use said element, in Natsu's case, lightning as part of his flames. What's interesting to note, however, is that this ability straight up doesn't apply to singling out that ability. So Natsu can't just breathe lightning by itself, or maybe more interestingly, as we see during Natsu's fight with Alderon, he says Atlas, Ignial, and Ignia's flames all exist in Natsu's fire, but Natsu simply explains that this is his fire, not theirs. And while there is clear differences between Natsu merging with someone's power directly, like we see what happens when Ignial gave Natsu Fire Dragon King mode, it becomes really obvious, for anyone who reads the story, that when Natsu eats someone's fire, or any element for that matter, it sticks with him, increasing his overall battle permanently by some fraction of the amount. And in the case of Ignial and Loxus, Natsu still seems to be able to use the transformations and techniques they gave him, even if they are weaker versions created by his magic alone, as opposed to a full combination of both. Speaking of those though, oh boy, let's just rattle off all of Natsu's forms that he probably still has access to, so no one gets too mad at me. And to round out this section, we'll just talk about Natsu's 4-ish forms. Number 1, Black Fire Dragon Mode. Okay, look, this is just a general spot for all the times Natsu eats someone's fire and doesn't bother or can't use them again. This would include the God Flames on Tenro, the Dark Regulus in the anime, or really any temporary power-up. For 9 out of 10 of every OP flame he eats, this is basically what would happen. Number 2, Lightning Flame Dragon Mode. This mode is very weird. It's directly compared to his Dragon Force upon initial use, but sees very little success outside of that. So my thoughts are basically this. It's a very strenuous form that has something akin to a 2x multiplier based on Natsu's early statement regarding Dragon Force's power. but it was likely stronger on its first use when he didn't have to make that lightning all by himself. Number 3. Fire Dragon King Mode. Now this is a form. Similar to the prior entry, this form's initial use was godlike, but it too lost its insane multiplier. This time much more concretely, because unlike all of Natsu's other modes, this form was both a multiplication and an addition. The original Fire Dragon King mode increased Natsu's base power, of course, but also initially added the power of Igneal from his tattoo. This buff was so huge that it made human Natsu stronger than pre-Fairy Heart Zareth and allowed him to one-shot a Spriggan, and likely even made him a rival for Acnologia. The problem here though is after Igneal died and Natsu lost both his tattoo and power, this form basically became relegated to just another part of his base form. And that's not to call it weak at all. It's probably a similar or greater than 2 or 3 times increase, being narratively above Lightning Dragon Flame mode, and it did even play a role in the defeat of the same OP Fairy Heart Zareth we've been talking about this whole video. But as you'll see in about 2 seconds, it's not the biggest player here, as that would have to be number 4, Dragon Force. As it's literally described, the ultimate trump card for any Dragon Slayer. Now, Dragon Force by itself isn't exactly the nail in the coffin for Natsu's super plot powers, it just speeds up his dragonization process, which is actually how it makes him so strong, but even the most crude uses of this form back at the beginning of the series are confirmed to make him as much as 3 times stronger. And since the time skip, we see Natsu beat up on a certain Mardir using Dragon Force, who could already take hits from Lightning Dragon Flame mode's 2 or 3 times power much easier, obviously implying that even natural Dragon Force by itself gets stronger as time passes. The real evidence for this though comes in the form of Natsu developing red scales, because like I mentioned earlier, narratively Dragon Force is implied to only be weaker than the power of just turning into an actual dragon. Couple this with Natsu being more draconified, and I would say it's pretty easy to argue that Lightning mode is below King mode, and full Dragon Force is above both of them, and its original non-scaly incarnations. The problem for confirming this comes back to that pesky Fire Dragon King mode though, as ever since the time skip, Natsu has been dead set on always using it in conjunction with his Dragon Force. These 2 power-ups have literally become inseparably stacked in his arsenal, also, in theory, combining their multipliers, as I'll get into right now in the power scaling section. Now, if all of that gibberish up till now hasn't confused you enough, I'm about to show you some numbers that will blow your mind. But first, let's start with some simple scaling to dip our toes into the pool of confusion that is Fairy Tail. For almost every relevant character by the end of Fairy Tail, and especially into the 100-year quest, the easiest thing we can scale them to are the Spriggan 12. A final group of ultimate biggie bads for the series who were tasked with supporting Zareth in the last stretch of the manga's original run. Most specifically, let's look at Assault Mode Wall, as he, being as middle of the pack as one can be in a group of bad guys, can turn his magic power into a pocket Etherion cannon. The Etherion cannon is a weapon of pure ether nano and is stated to be capable of wiping entire countries off the face of the earth in a single blast. It's very easy and very consistent to say every one of the Spriggan 12 are at least large country level, with the strongest among them like Irene and August being actual dragons, and even compared to Zareth, potentially scaling up to continental off of Irene's meteor feat, or higher with Zareth scaling to potentially back up the notion. Now, for the most basic interpretation of where Natsu could be sitting at the end of the original anime run, he and his friends all handle the weaker Spriggans without too much difficulty, with Natsu himself pretty much one-shotting his particular enemy using Fire Dragon King mode, with his base and weaker forms being around large country to continental. However, from his fights with both Zareth and Acnologia, he obviously needed some more massive leaps in fighting power to compete, which is where Dragon Force plus Fire Dragon King mode came in. These two have a bevy of statements that imply their world-ending power, from Zareth being stronger than the world-ending Phoenix, to Acnologia being stronger than Dragon Cry, a magical tool stated to be stronger than dozens of Etherion cannons going off at once, or even just countless implications that other god tiers could do it. Keeping in mind these upper echelons, a pre-100-year quest Natsu is easily large country level to continental plus, without special narrative amps. Similar to Loxus, Urza, Grey, and other strong Fairy Tail mages. However, this is a video about this Natsu, not this Natsu. So for all the manga readers out there, I'm sure you'd like to know, has Natsu caught up to these two? Well, this is another example of Natsu's power fluctuating wildly, as the most commonly cited lines of scaling refer to these main enemies of the 100-year quest, the Dragon Gods, being stated to be equal to Acnologia, even ignoring their feats of tampering with the oceans, moons, and threatening the world themselves. with one of them, Alderaan, taking on a Fire Dragon King Natsu's Destruction Fist dead on before getting quoted to say that Natsu did exactly 1 point of damage out of Alderaan's give or take 100 million hit points. This shows base Fire Dragon King mode Natsu to be very weak still compared to top tiers, and even maybe high tiers like Dragon Irene, who could at least actually square off with Acno. However, the tricky part comes in when Natsu taps into his full power, something he can now seemingly do on command and uses what I'll call Flame King plus Dragon Force, now seemingly with those added powers of Igneous Flames, Son of Igneal and fellow Dragon God, at his disposal. This form lets him make this powerhouse insane Dragon God look like your everyday average fairy tale enemy. And even if you try and lowball this Natsu, it's just totally inconsistent, as Flame Dragon King plus Dragon Force, with these new Ignea Flames embedded in his system, has made him stronger than ever. Capable of not only beating one Dragon God, but blatantly matching another's breath attack. And while it's not entirely clear how strong this Natsu is yet, in almost all of his truly god tier forms, from Igneal's power to 7 Dragon Flames, and especially this Fusion Dragon Force E&D King form mode, he is easily closing in on multi-continental, if not verging on higher, due to the many life-wiping characters in Fairy Tail, which all somehow happen to fall short of his godlike plot armor. For him to be any lower would just be blasphemy. The only thing keeping him from a potentially planet-level meta in my mind is a lack of clear upscaling from blatantly multi-continental feats, such as Zareth being similar to the Phoenix, but only ambiguously below Acno. So until some character comes along who can blatantly powercliff the rest of the series, I think planet level will be a little too hard to gauge. And if you were curious about speed, Natsu dodged Pure Light as early as the Grand Magic Games, and gets much faster from there, with FTL being an easy guarantee. No precog though. As for a general rule of thumb of how I'd like to rank some of these other forms, I think true Fire Dragon King mode is the weakest of the strong, as Igneal is definitively below Acno, with Savage Dragon Force being the form he used to beat Fairy Heart coming up next, as it's just his E&D powers on top of his regular powers. After that, I would have to say 100 Year Quest Natsu's Dragon Force would be the third strongest, then 7 Dragon Flames at second for being able to beat SBT Acno, and finally Ignea Flame Natsu, which should as of right now be considered his peak. If he fought someone like Old Man Yama and ate his flames, he would likely end up as wild and unhinged as in that form, closing in on Moon level debatably, but all 5 of his quote-unquote modes I listed above should be reasonably close to one another, with Natsu being multi-continental to Moon easily, and planet level with a high ball no matter which of them you pick. And that would likely even include his fight with Animus. This was a ridiculously long video to make though, so I won't make you sit through any kind of lengthy outro. If you liked it and want to see more from this series or Natsu, hit like and subscribe, tell me in the comments what you'd like to see next, and that's all for today. Thanks, everyone.